Welcome back, everyone. We are back with another lesson on supply chain and logistics. And today, in lesson number 3, we're going to talk about what is the importance of supply chain decisions. If you want to catch up on the rest of the lessons, I'm going to link them in the cards or somewhere down below. And you could catch up on lesson 1 and 2. So let's get to it. What is the importance of supply chain decisions? This is part of the Learning Logistics series, and this is lesson number 3. Now, we got to understand before we move forward and before we keep on the lessons that there is a close connection between the design and the management of supply chain flows and the success of a supply chain. Now, if you remember back in previous lessons, I talked about what are supply chain flows. And supply chain flows are the material, information, and finances that move back and forth among the supply chain members and at all times. So keep that in mind. Now we need to understand this because as we move forward in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about supply chain decisions. And we break those decisions down into stages or phases. So remember that there is a very close connection between how we design our supply chain and how we manage our supply chain. Because ultimately what we want to do is have a successful supply chain. Now, the most important takeaway from this lesson would be this here in particular, that supply chain design, planning, and operation decisions play a significant role in the success or failure of a company. Now, keep this in mind. This is very important to know. And as we move forward, we're going to begin to understand what is supply chain design, what is supply chain planning, and what are supply chain operations. But we need to know that how we do these decisions at these different stages are really going to make or break a company's wealth or health and obviously their supply chain. So for companies to stay competitive, supply chains have to adapt to changing technologies and to changing expectations. This is also another step. Okay, we planned, we designed, we operate our supply chains, we manage them. But then the way that we make sure that we stay competitive is to be able to have those supply chains adapt as changes happens, as changes in customer trends, changes in technology, changes in the industry, changes in policies and regulations that government agencies might apply. Everything has to be done in a way that we structure our supply chains, but we can also adapt those supply chains as we encounter obstacles or issues or changes to our environments. If you think of companies like Walmart, like Amazon, like 7-Eleven, they're great examples of companies that have built their success on superior supply chain design, on supply chain planning, and operations in all of their supply chains. These are companies that have been able to build those supply chains in a way that create them success for their company, and also they're able to adapt them as changes happen. On the flip side, or in contrast, the failure of many businesses, such as online food delivery, Webvan, if you can recall them back when that was the internet was getting popular with these sort of services, their failure can really be attributed to the weaknesses in their supply chain design and in their supply chain planning. If you're old enough to remember as well, you can remember Borders bookstores as well and how they rised and they fell. And that was all due to the lack of adaptability in their supply chains. And this was during a time when the environment was changing, customer expectations was changing, they were increasing rapidly, and they were not able to adapt to that completely. Now, one example that we'll discuss later in the lesson here is Dell, which I also discussed earlier, and it's going to make sense once I connect the two. But we're going to talk about Dell computers again, because Dell at one particular point after they created the supply chain, they had to actually revise elements of it so that they could respond to changes in technology in their industry that they were working in and to the customer needs as well. So we're going to have an example of that later on in the lesson. Successful supply chain management really requires to make many decisions relating to the flows of a supply chain. Remember, flows are the material, the information, and the finances. Now, each decision should be made to raise the supply chain surplus. We talked about supply chain surplus as well. So the decisions that we make in our supply chain, they're going to be broken down into types of decisions. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So these decisions fall into three categories or phases. That's going to be supply chain strategy or design. They're known as both. I usually call them design. But the first one is supply chain strategy or design. Second one is supply chain planning. And the third type of decisions are supply chain operations. Now, all the activities that we have within a supply chain, they'll fall under these categories, but they'll do so depending on the frequency of each decision and the time frame during which a decision phase has an impact. As a result, each category or decisions must consider uncertainty over the decision horizon. Let's break that down again. All right. It sounds a little complicated. It's really not. So think about all the decisions that we have to make in our supply chain, right? It's countless decisions. All of them are going to have to fall under one of these categories or types of decisions. And mainly the way that we do that is based on the time frame or the frequency that we have to make those decisions on. So longer, bigger decisions are going to be more in the design structure. Shorter ones are going to be in the planning, and day-to-day, more day-to-day or week-to-week activities are going to be more in the supply chain operation side. So we're gonna break those down. So we're gonna break those down next. So we have the first one that we're going to talk about here is supply chain strategy or design. Now, during this phase, a company decides how to structure the supply chain over the next several years. This is sort of, and you can think of it as sort of building the blueprint or building a roadmap. We're building a roadmap because companies are going to have to make some decisions about how to configure the supply chain, how resources will be allocated, and what processes will be performed at each stage. So, as I said, you could think of this as creating the roadmap for how our supply chains will work or how our supply chains will function. Now, supply chains are not just randomly created or when companies come together, but that's not how it happens. There's a lot of planning that goes on behind that. So supply chains, they have to be configured in a way that it makes sense for the company and for the products and the services that they would sell. And it has to take into consideration the resources that we have, as well as the resources of our partners within our supply chain. Now, we also have to implement processes that will be easy to take into action and actually replicate once we get to a larger scale. Okay, so in this phase of supply chain decisions, think of things that we have to build for many years ahead or things that will be used for many years to come. So these are more considered the long-term decisions, right? Now, part of creating the supply chain roadmap is thinking about the strategic decisions for the future of the company. Makes sense, right? Now, in this phase, we make these decisions, and these are some of them. For example, we decide whether to outsource or perform a supply chain function in-house, or do we take it out externally and outsource the service because it makes more sense economically, or it makes more sense for us because we don't have the resources to get them done externally, or what we know as outsource. We also have to make decisions on the location and capacities of production and warehousing facilities. If we're going to manufacture something or build something, we have to decide where we're going to place those facilities to build and what are the capacities that we have to produce something. So we have to make decisions on those. We have to decide on the products that will be manufactured or stored at various locations, meaning what kind of products are we going to make? Is it going to be a full line of products? Is it going to be one or two only to start? And where are we going to keep that inventory once we do make those products, or once we do have that inventory, where are we going to keep it? The next decision we have to make are sort of the modes of transportation that will be made available along the different shipping routes. Along with having products and building products or having inventory of finished goods, we have to decide how we're going to transport these goods. What kind of modes of transportation, meaning is it air, land, ocean, uh, however we're going to transport these products, and how do we make sure that the shipping routes we use are the most effective for our supply chains. We'll also have to make decisions on the types of information systems that will be used throughout the different departments. This is more moving into how do we want to communicate with our partners within a supply chain, and what type of IT system or information systems do we want to use to be able to communicate with them and share that flow of information, right? Because that's also we talked about materials. How do we share that information, right? That's when we decide what kind of information systems we want to use. Is it going to be a WMS, an ERP, or TMS system? And that's really going to make sense based on your needs within your supply chain and based on the partners that we have within our supply chains as well. A company will also have to make sure that the supply chain design supports the strategic objectives and increases the supply chain surplus. If you remember back from lesson number 2, the supply chain surplus is the value a supply chain generates, which is the difference between the value of the product in the eyes of the consumer or the customer and the cost that the supply chain incurs to provide the product. So when a company is designing their supply chain or creating the structure for their supply chain, they have to make sure that it aligns with what they want to achieve in the long term, and it also finds a way to increase our supply chain surplus, meaning that it's going to make us money, that the customer is going to value the product we have, and that the costs that are going to be associated with our supply chains are not astronomical, but that they do make sense and they're enough that between the value of the customer gives to our products and the cost that we incur, we have a decent enough supply chain surplus. So just to give you another visual on that, customer value minus supply chain cost equals supply chain surplus. And this is what we learned in the previous lesson, which is what is the objectives of a supply chain. So this is a very important concept that we are carrying along, because this is going to make sense, or it's going to matter into the next few lessons that we learn. Supply chain design decisions are typically made for the long term, think in years, and are expensive to change on short notice. That is why we carefully plan in the design phase of our supply chains, because companies also need to take into consideration that every supply chain has a certain level of uncertainty, and they need to look to anticipate any kind of changes to market conditions, consumer trends, you name it, over the next few years, so that we can plan in a way that prepares our supply chains to meet these challenges as they happen. Now, this is what we segue into the next phase, which is the supply chain planning phase. In the previous phase, in the supply chain design, we make long-term plans that are implemented for years ahead or years in advance. This planning phase that we're talking about now, we make decisions on a more quarter to quarter or quarter up to a year basis, no longer than that. So these are considered more midterm planning compared to supply chain design, which was long-term planning. Now, once we are fixed on the design of the supply chain, we begin to plan to achieve those goals that we established. So, what is the goal, you ask? Well, the goal in planning is to maximize the supply chain surplus. Are you seeing a trend here? We're mentioning this a lot, supply chain surplus. Well, that is because it is an important concept. So the goal in planning is to maximize the supply chain surplus that will be generated over the planning horizon and under the specifications we made in the design phase. Companies start to plan, or they start the planning phase with a forecast for the coming year or a similar time frame. And this is a forecast of the demand and of other factors like cost and prices in different markets. Now, specifically, demand forecast is known as the process of making a future estimate or a prediction, you could think of it, in relation to the customer demand over a specific period. We're sort of predicting what the consumer demand or the customer demand might look like for a particular time period. Now, when we forecast for demand, we usually use historical data and other types of analytical information to be able to create the most accurate forecast or most accurate prediction. And if you want to learn more about demand planning, I'm going to link one of our videos in the description below or somewhere here in the cards that you can check out our What is Demand Planning video, where we talk a lot more in detail about what is demand planning. But for the sake of this lesson here, just know that demand plan or demand planning is where we forecast or we estimate or make a prediction as to what we think the demand will be for the upcoming year or time frame. In this stage, planning includes making decisions regarding a couple of things, and these are just a few. Now, we can decide, for example, which markets will be supplied from which locations, meaning we have our products, we created that idea of our product lines. But now in this sort of planning phase, now we have to figure out which markets we're going to be supplying those products to and from which locations, right? Because, for example, if you have product that needs to be sold or distributed in the US, it might make sense to supply from a manufacturing facility, maybe in Mexico, somewhere that is closer in distance so that your transportation and routing costs are less and it makes more sense. Instead, if you're having some other manufacturing facility where you can supply products to Europe, it makes sense to have those products be supplied from a different location. We can also make decisions in this stage about the subcontracting of manufacturing. We can make decisions on the inventory policies that would be followed and the timing and size of market and pricing promotions. So again, these are just some planning or some of the things that we can do within this planning phase. There's plenty more, and there's too many to list here in one lesson. But for now, just know that the planning or the decisions that we make within the planning phase are decisions that are more quarter to quarter or quarter to year, and they could be made based on what we need to implement as far as getting products out to a particular location and whether we can subcontract manufacturing facilities because there might be some restrictions on our own. And what are some of the inventory policies that will follow so that inventory management can take that into consideration, and as well as who we're going to market those products to, when we're going to do that, and how big is that marketing and promotions going to be for the company. All right, so just a few. The planning establishes the parameters within which a supply chain will function over a specific period of time. In this planning phase, companies have to keep in mind that level of uncertainty we talked about earlier, but they also have to consider uncertainty in demand, uncertainty in exchange rates, and their competition over this time horizon in their planning decisions. Now, this is all done because companies need to define a set of operating policies for their short-term operations, which is the next phase that we'll talk about. And you see how it flows, right? So we made the supply chain decisions for our design. We make our supply chain decisions for the planning, which is more midterm. And we make now our supply chain operation decisions, which rely on what we previously established. In this phase, we work on a weekly or daily basis, which is a much shorter time frame. During this phase, companies make decisions regarding individual customer orders. That's the best way to look at it. In the operations phase, we're making decisions more regarding the individual customer orders. Again, to recap, in phase one, we fix the design, and in phase two, we create the planning and operation policies. Here in phase 3, we focus on the day-to-day activities that handle incoming orders in the best possible way, in the most effective way. During this operations phase, we can make a couple of decisions, or a couple of things will happen. For example, this is again just a few. Firms have to allocate inventory or production to individual orders. We need to set a date that an order is to be filled. We have to generate what is known as a pick list at a warehouse so that we can get that order ready. We have to allocate an order to a particular shipping mode and shipment, meaning how we're going to get this order out to our customer and how is that going to happen. We need to set delivery schedule of trucks or any kind of transportation to get that final lap or that final leg of the delivery out to the customer. And we have to place replenishment orders so the cycle can start all back up again. All right, so these are just a few of the decisions that we make within the operations phase. And next, or in the next lesson, and this is just a little bit of foreshadowing, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about cycles and processes and how we make that these cycles within the different parts of our supply chain function, and how do we talk about those cycles. So stay tuned for the next lesson, because we talked about that in the upcoming lesson. Now, because operational decisions are being made in a shorter time frame, you could think of within days, within hours, even sometimes within minutes, there is less uncertainty about the demand information, because it is information that's happening there. And we can have, the shorter we can get the demand information, the less room there is for error. So keep that in mind as well. That's a thing from the demand plan. The shorter the time frame, the more accurate the forecast, or the more accurate the demand information. Now, given the constraints established by the configuration and planning policies, so the previous phases, the goal during the operation phase is to reduce uncertainty and to optimize performance. That's the goal here. The goal in the operations phase is to reduce uncertainty and to optimize performance. And this brings us to example number 1. This is Dell computers. We're going to loop around back to Dell because it does bring a good point to emphasize some of the things that we learned today in this lesson. Dell is an example of a company that has adapted their supply chain design, their planning, and operations based on customer trends and demand shifts. Now, given the industry that they operate in, which is technology, they have to adapt the supply chain in response to shifts in technology and to customer expectations. Dell's supply chain has transformed significantly since the company pioneered its direct-to-consumer model for PCs in the 1990s, and it found success with it in the 2000s. In lesson number 2, I talked about what are some of the supply chain factors within Dell and what is this model look like, or what does it entail. And in this lesson, it is relevant again to showcase how Dell's customer-centered and lean approach, has enabled the company to remain competitive despite the rise of tech giants like Apple. Now, here we're going to talk about some of the elements that have helped Dell and have made their supply chains successful. One of them is direct sales, or direct to consumer sales, or sometimes known as B2C, or business to customer or business to consumer sales. Now, Dell's direct sales strategy has really helped Dell bypass the retailer portion of their supply chain, and has allowed them to increase profits on units sold. And at the same time, it has allowed them to gain visibility into what its customers want. Designing their supply chains around this model has helped the company gain valuable data on customer behavior and what are their preferences, which is in return has allowed Dell to continuously improve their products and their delivery options so they can keep up with ever-changing trends. Well, why is this important? Well, we talked about demand and we talked about demand information, right? So compiling and analyzing all this customer data that Dell has access to has given them an advantage when it comes to demand forecasting and planning. and why supply chain design is heavily impacted by consumer demand and market need. Another factor in their supply chain success is customization to segmented strategy. If you order a Dell PC 15 or 20 years ago, the company offered heavy customization process when placing your order, in which essentially you were building your machine or designing your machine from scratch. You chose the different features, the different components, the ports, the drives, the screens, everything, right? Now, customers will receive a computer that met their specifications and they will get exactly what they needed without paying for features that they had no use for. For Dell, customization enabled better monitoring of quality of components and kept on-hand inventory pretty low. This reduced waste and overflow, and this is how Dell designed their product offering and hence their supply chain. However, in the 2010s, we started to see changes in the market, and we began to see that there was a heavier influence on what consumers wanted. And consumers wanted less customization and faster deliveries. We can attribute that to, the impact of Amazon on getting deliveries faster and people being more excited about faster deliveries rather than a heavily customized computer from Dell. So Dell had to switch to a segmented approach where they offer customers the following choices when purchasing a PC. You could do it configurable, which was where customers can build with unique needs and exactly how they want it. You could do a pre-configured, which is for customers who opt to have some of Dell's adjust the product based on specifications provided. And they also provided ready to ship, which is for customers who wanted their order fast and they just wanted to see what was already in stock in inventory. They did this by remaining flexible enough to implement this approach with their product and with their supply chains. They were able to continue providing customers with a choice of options, meaning they didn't completely remove the customization part, but they actually added other elements to it. So they were able to continue providing customers with a choice of options while also simplifying its process to drive efficiency and allow for a faster delivery. The company's supply chain was then remodeled to enable these deliveries within these three different options. So again, a company as big as Dell, they structure their supply chain, they design their supply chains around what they originally were offering as far as their product line. And then they had to sort of remodel and tweak some of the things that they had to do for their supply chains because consumer trends changed. And it wasn't so customization heavy, but now it's more about when can we get it the fastest. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind. Another factor in Dell's supply chain success was the inventory management goals. Dell relies on a speedy manufacturing process to keep up with orders, enabling it to hold inventory for no longer than 6 days and cutting down on warehousing costs. Now, it has also outsourced a large fraction of its assembly to low-cost locations, effectively building to stock rather than to customer order. Along with this, Dell has also achieved this success because they have strong supplier relationships. Dell has prioritized the building of a strong supplier relationships to carry out its low inventory strategy, which is mentioned, and to be able to continue to meet consumer demand. Suppliers for Dell, including Samsung, Motorola, and Sony, typically maintain manufacturing facilities near Dell facilities to cut down on transportation time and cost. In this type of operation, communication is going to be key because we need to make sure that is as smooth as possible. This is why Dell uses a platform known as Value Chain to share inventory data with suppliers to help them plan accordingly in a process known as VMI or vendor managed inventory. And I'm going to make a video on a whole video or a whole lesson on vendor managed inventory for those of you that are interested. So stay tuned. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, a company has to adapt to change, right? And Dell is no exception. And Dell is adapting to the changing environment post-COVID. Now, the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic really led to massive disruptions in supply chains. We all were witness to that. We all saw that. But this was especially true for companies that relied on Chinese manufacturers. And with China being a tech manufacturing hub, companies like Dell were forced to assess the level of risk in their supply chain and find ways to minimize disruption. This may lead to a wave of reshoring or nearshoring of suppliers for tech companies like Dell. So, the biggest point or the biggest takeaway from this lesson is that the design, planning, and operations of a supply chain have a strong impact on the overall profitability and success of a company. So everything that we learned today really is to understand this point and to understand that how we design, how we plan, and how we operate our supply chains has a direct impact on how successful your company will be. And we can easily see that for companies like Walmart and like Dell, the way that they planned for their supply chains, the way that they designed their supply chains, and how they operate their supply chains really has attributed to their massive success. And most importantly, these companies being able to remain flexible enough where if issues happen to their supply chains or there's massive disruptions to their supply chains, they're still able to implement changes that can minimize the impacts of those issues to their company's overall health. Okay, so now this brings us to the end of lesson number 3. In future lessons, we'll talk about more in detail about these different phases, and we're going to learn all the different concepts and methodologies that are used in supply chain design, in supply chain planning, and in supply chain operations. But this was just sort of an introduction to that. And in lesson number 4, wow, we're coming up in lesson number 4. These are coming by fast. I will talk about what are the processes in a supply chain. So please stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching and keep watching our Learning Logistics series. If you're interested in a full supply chain course, you can check out the description below. We're open for enrollment for this session of Introduction to Supply Chain. I believe, yes, Introduction to Supply Chain, which is a course that I created that has a very good sort of self-paced online portal where you have all the lessons that we talked about in the course, but you also get access to 8 live Zoom sessions with your instructor, in this case, me. And we get to talk about everything within supply chain management and logistics. And you can ask all the questions you might have about the industry, about working in supply chain, or any other questions you might have as you move through the content and the materials and lessons. So if you're interested in that course, you can register in the link below. We're open for enrollment as of February in 2023. So that's what we're hoping to do now. Thank you so much for watching again. I'm Professor Rodriguez. See you in the next lesson.